A young soldier stood backstage, hands trembling so badly he couldn't keep them still. It was 1961, the USS Arizona Memorial dedication in Hawaii, and Elvis Presley had been asked to perform to raise funds for the monument. The event was packed. Officers, dignitaries, press, hundreds of civilians who'd come to witness the king of rock and roll in person. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation, but backstage, in a narrow corridor behind the main stage, one man was coming apart at the seams. His name was James Carver, and he was 19 years old. He'd been stationed in Hawaii for 6 months, part of a naval honor guard detail. He was supposed to be there just to stand watch, to maintain the ceremonial presence that military protocol demanded. Nobody expected him to interact with the performers. Nobody expected him to be noticed at all. He was background, decoration, just another young man in uniform filling space. But James had a problem that morning that nobody knew about. He'd been struggling with what doctors would later diagnose as severe social anxiety. In civilian life, it had cost him opportunities. He'd missed job interviews. He'd turned down promotions that required public speaking. He'd avoided social gatherings where he might have to introduce himself to strangers. His family had started to worry that this shy, quiet boy might spend his whole life living smaller than he was capable of living. When he enlisted in the Navy, he'd hoped military discipline would fix it. He'd thought that rigid structure and clear expectations might somehow override the paralysis that seized him whenever he was in front of people. Instead, the anxiety had metastasized. Now he was having panic attacks. His commanding officer had noticed. The other men in his unit had noticed. And on the morning of the Elvis performance, James Carver was standing backstage feeling like his chest was closing up, like his breath was becoming something he had to negotiate for rather than something that came naturally. He should have called in sick. He should have asked for a reassignment to the back of the auditorium where he could stand in darkness and be invisible. Instead, he showed up. And now he was backstage, and now Elvis Presley was 15 minutes away from taking the stage, and James's hands were shaking so badly that he'd clenched them into fists to hide it. Elvis came walking through the backstage area about 10 minutes before his performance. He moved with the kind of focused calm that comes from someone who's done this thousands of times. He was dressed in a simple black shirt and dark pants. No jumpsuit, nothing ostentatious. He was reviewing the set list with a sound technician, nodding, asking a question about the microphone, already transitioning into the mindset he needed to occupy for the next 30 minutes. He was 3 feet from James when he stopped walking. Not because he'd been told to stop, not because of any external cue. Something made him pause, and when he looked to his right, his eyes landed directly on James Carver. Elvis was not known for stopping to chat with stagehands or enlisted personnel. He was professional, cordial when directly addressed, but he didn't typically initiate conversation with people outside his immediate circle. So what happened next was, according to 3 eyewitnesses who were in that backstage area, completely out of character. Elvis walked directly toward James. He extended his hand. "Hey man, I'm Elvis." James's brain short-circuited. He knew who Elvis was. Everyone knew who Elvis was. He managed to take the extended hand and shake it, but his palms were wet with sweat, and his voice came out as a whisper when he said his name back. "James." Elvis didn't let go of his hand. He held it for another moment, and he looked directly into James's face, and he said something that changed the next 60 years of that young man's life. "You nervous about something, James?" It wasn't judgment. It wasn't casual observation. It was a real question, asked with genuine concern by someone who was apparently able to perceive that this kid standing in military dress was barely holding himself together. James's first instinct was to lie, to say he was fine, just fine, nothing to worry about. That's what the military had taught him. That's what generations of men in his family had modeled for him. You didn't admit weakness. You didn't admit fear. You swallowed it and you moved forward. But something about the way Elvis was looking at him made the lie catch in his throat. "Yeah," James said, I'm nervous around people, just in general, always have been." Elvis nodded slowly. He was still holding James's hand. Around them, other members of Elvis's entourage were doing their jobs, moving around, preparing. But in that moment, there was a kind of bubble around just these 2 men, a private conversation happening in a public space. "You know what," Elvis said, "I get nervous too." James heard this and didn't believe it. How could he? Elvis Presley was the most confident man James had ever seen. The idea that this person, who walked into auditoriums of thousands and commanded their attention like it was his birthright, could experience nervousness seemed like a kindness, a lie told to make James feel better. Elvis seemed to know exactly what James was thinking. He smiled, and it was a real smile, not a performance smile. "I do," he said. "Every single time I walk on a stage, I'm nervous. You know why?" James shook his head. "Because it matters. If I didn't care about getting it right, I wouldn't be nervous. The nervousness means it means something to you, and that's the only reason to do anything in the first place." The 5-minute warning came through a backstage speaker. Elvis's band was taking the stage. His attention shifted slightly, but he didn't release his grip on James's hand. "You want to know something else?" Elvis continued. "That nervousness you're feeling, the thing that's been following you around, that's not a weakness, man. That's sensitivity. You're sensitive to how people perceive you. That used to be considered a good thing. People with sensitivity, people with conscience, they were the ones who changed the world." 2 minutes until Elvis's performance. Elvis squeezed James's hand once firmly. "You're going to be fine, more than fine. You're going to be great, but you have to stop being afraid of being visible. You can't hide your whole life just because people might judge you. Some people will. Some people won't. Most people won't even notice. And the ones that do, they're probably dealing with their own nervousness right next to you." He released James's hand, and in that moment, someone called his name and Elvis turned toward the stage. He took 3 steps toward the wings, then he stopped and turned back. "Hey, James, watch the performance from the front if you can, not the back, the front. You deserve to see it clearly, and you deserve to let people see you. That's how you start getting over this." Then he was gone. He walked through the curtain and out onto the stage, and 3,000 people immediately roared, and the noise was so overwhelming that it seemed to physically shake the backstage area. James stood alone in the corridor for a moment. His hands had stopped shaking. His breath came easily now. His heart was still racing, but it was a different kind of racing. It was the racing of someone who'd just been seen. He made a decision in that moment. He was going to do what Elvis had said. He was going to watch the performance from the front, not hidden at the back like he always did. Front. The only way to reach the front of the auditorium from backstage was to walk through the main event space, which meant walking past people, which meant being visible. It was exactly the thing his anxiety told him never to do, but something had shifted. The nervousness was still there, but it felt different now. It felt purposeful. James walked through the backstage exit and into the auditorium. He moved down the right side aisle toward the stage, and as he did, he was aware of the eyes that tracked him. Some people watched him pass. Some turned to see who he was. The old James would have felt that attention as pressure, as a threat, as confirmation that he didn't belong. But he just spent 5 minutes talking to a man who seemed to genuinely believe that sensitivity and nervousness weren't character flaws. So he kept walking, and he found a spot near the front, and he watched Elvis Presley perform for the USS Arizona Memorial, and the experience was transcendent. Elvis sang an American trilogy that day, the same song he would become famous for later, but back then it was a relatively uncommon choice, a deep dive into spiritual tradition. He sang with the kind of intensity that suggested this wasn't just a performance. This was a man trying to reach something true. And James Carver stood 15 feet from the stage and let himself be present. He didn't hide. He didn't shrink. He stood there in his naval uniform, and he let the music touch him, and he let the people around him see him being moved by it. Something released in his chest that day, not completely, not permanently, but enough that he noticed it, enough that he realized that visibility wasn't the threat he'd believed it to be. The performance ended. Elvis left the stage. The event concluded. James returned to his barracks that evening with a mind that was quieter than it had been in months. Over the following weeks, James began to change. Not overnight, not dramatically, but measurably. He started joining his unit for meals instead of eating alone. He volunteered for a promotion that would require him to train new recruits. He signed up for a public speaking class offered through the base. He found a letter-writing group where sailors would sit together and write to families back home, reading their letters aloud to each other. Each of these things would have terrified him before. Now they seemed like small challenges worth accepting. The nervousness didn't disappear, but it stopped being an obstacle. It became information. It told him that he was doing something that mattered. James served 22 years in the Navy. He eventually became a communications officer, a role that involved public presentations and regular interaction with large groups. It wasn't his natural comfort zone, but he'd learned to occupy it anyway. He'd learned that being visible was survivable, that being judged was survivable, that the alternative, hiding, was worse than anything that could happen if he stepped forward. After he left the Navy, James became a high school guidance counselor. For 34 years, he worked with teenagers who struggled with the same things that had almost derailed him as a young man. He had a reputation for seeing something in students that other people missed. He could identify the sensitive ones, the ones who felt things too deeply, the ones who retreated from the world because they believed themselves to be fundamentally flawed. And he would tell them about a man he'd met once, backstage at a concert, who had told him that sensitivity wasn't weakness. That nervousness meant something mattered, that you couldn't hide your whole life just because you were afraid. He never mentioned Elvis by name. James kept that encounter private, almost sacred. But he carried the lesson forward, and it moved through the lives of hundreds of students who went on to become teachers themselves, and artists, and public speakers, and leaders of various kinds. People who might have retreated into quiet lives, but instead chose visibility over and over again, because someone had once helped them understand that it was worth it. In 2011, James was invited to speak at his alma mater high school. The reunion was celebrating the class of 1960, the class that had graduated just before James enlisted. He was 69 years old at the time. He was about to address a gymnasium full of people he'd known 50 years earlier. He was nervous. He would always be nervous before speaking in front of crowds. But now he understood what that nervousness meant. It meant something mattered. He walked out onto that stage, and he told the story of meeting Elvis Presley backstage. It was the first time he'd ever publicly spoken the encounter in detail. And he talked about how a 5-minute conversation with a man who was famous for one thing had given him permission to become himself. He said, "I spent the first 30 years of my life thinking that being nervous was a sign that I should retreat. I thought it meant I wasn't cut out for visibility, for leadership, for standing in front of people and being seen. But I met a man once who helped me understand something different. He helped me understand that everyone is nervous, that everyone doubts, that the difference between people who hide and people who become visible isn't that some people are fearless. It's that some people decide that the thing they're afraid of is worth being afraid of. And I'm standing here telling you now, and I wish someone had told me this when I was 19 years old. I wish someone had said clearly, you're going to feel fear. You're going to feel like you don't belong. But that feeling is not a fact about you. That's just what sensitivity feels like. That's just what care feels like. And the world needs people who feel things that deeply. The world needs people who hesitate before they speak because they're thinking about what they're saying. The world needs people who understand that every moment matters because they feel every moment. A woman named Margaret Chen was sitting in the third row of that gymnasium. She was there for the reunion, a classmate of James's, and she got to know him better during the evening portion of the event. Afterward, she sought him out and asked if she could share something with him. She told him that her grandson, who was 10 years old, had anxiety similar to what James had described. The boy was gifted academically but refused to participate in class. He wouldn't raise his hand. He wouldn't present projects. He'd convinced himself that something was fundamentally wrong with him. Margaret had brought him along to the reunion, hoping that exposure to accomplished adults might inspire him. He was in the gymnasium when James gave his speech. And when James finished, the boy had turned to Margaret with tears running down his face and asked, "Is that really what being nervous means? That something matters?" Margaret was crying when she told James this, and James was crying while he listened. And they stood together in the gymnasium parking lot as the sun was setting, and James said something that felt important. "I think," he said, "the thing that nobody tells you is that the people you're most afraid of becoming visible to are dealing with their own invisibility. We're all nervous. We're all quiet. We're all afraid. And we're all hoping someone will see us and tell us that it's okay." Over the next 5 years, Margaret brought her grandson to see James several times. The boy eventually found his way to public speaking. He joined the debate team. He became less anxious not because the anxiety disappeared, but because he stopped believing it meant he was broken. In 2016, James turned 84 years old. He was beginning to experience health problems. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulation of age. His children wanted him to slow down, to stop taking on so many projects, to start living the kind of quiet retirement that people his age were supposed to be living. James refused. "If I stop being visible now," he told his daughter, "I'll have spent the last 5 years of my life invisible, and I didn't give up 55 years of visibility just to end it that way." He continued counseling students, mentoring teachers, and speaking at events until he had a stroke in early 2018. It wasn't catastrophic. He recovered with physical therapy, but it slowed him down. It made it clear that his time was becoming limited. He spent his final 2 years writing. He wrote letters to every student he'd counseled who he could track down. He wrote a small book about his work as a guidance counselor and what he'd learned from the teenagers he'd served. He wrote a detailed account of his meeting with Elvis, including the exact words as he remembered them, and he left it with his family with instructions to share it if they felt it was appropriate. James Carver died on March 15, 2020, 2 weeks before his 88th birthday. His obituary in the local newspaper was straightforward. He'd been a military officer, a teacher, a counselor. He'd touched thousands of lives, but it didn't mention the meeting that had changed everything. That story came out 3 months later, when his daughter found his handwritten account and shared it with a local reporter. The reporter interviewed people who'd worked with James over the years, and the story slowly began to circulate. A quiet, ordinary man whose entire life had been shaped by a 5-minute conversation backstage at a concert. What's remarkable about this story is not that it's unusual. It's that it's so ordinary. It's the kind of encounter that probably happens regularly, the kind of moment where one person sees another person and offers a word of encouragement that somehow lands exactly when it's needed most. But most of those moments disappear. They happen and then they're gone, and only the person who received the kindness remembers. We don't know how many people Elvis Presley changed in 5-minute encounters because he had the gift of seeing someone and knowing they needed a specific word. He probably didn't remember James Carver after that day. He probably didn't know that a casual conversation backstage had altered the trajectory of one man's entire life, and through that man, the lives of hundreds of others. That's what makes these moments so important. We rarely know if we're living through one. We don't know if a conversation we have today with a stranger is going to be the conversation that changes their entire life. We don't know if the 5 minutes we spend with someone who seems ordinary to us is actually the fulcrum point around which their entire future is going to rotate. James Carver lived his life knowing that one person had believed in him at a moment when he didn't believe in himself. He carried that knowledge forward into every room he entered, and he spent decades creating the conditions where other people could have that same experience, where they could be seen by someone who knew that sensitivity wasn't weakness, that nervousness meant something mattered, that visibility was survivable. The world is filled with people who are standing backstage in their own lives, hands shaking, convinced that they don't belong. The world is also filled with people who could be the Elvis in someone else's story, the person who stops, the person who sees, the person who says the thing that needs to be said. We don't know which role we're playing on any given day, but we could know if we paid attention. We could know if we slowed down enough to notice when someone is trembling. We could know if we asked the questions that might open someone up. We could know if we offered the words that might change someone's life. The choice you make in those moments is the only choice that ever really matters.